Welcome to the Designer to Dev podcast. I'm your host, Lenora Porter, and I come to you today with 8 design podcasts that I personally love. Let's get started. Before we get started, though, of course, I have to drink my tea, okay? Before I give y'all the tea. So let me drink some tea. Okay, boom, let's start. Before we go into the list of 8, I do want to separate 3 podcasts that I absolutely adore. It is very unique because no one else talks about it. And the only way that I can get to hear it is with these 3 podcasts. So, that particular topic is around Black communities when it comes to design. These are topics that not many people talk about. So, when it comes to those podcasts and I see they have a new episode, honey, I'm clicking. So let's start off with the first podcast, and that is called the Just Us podcast. I absolutely adore this podcast, mainly because there is a few people that's actually in a few of my groups that, host this podcast. However, outside of that though, this podcast reminds me of a podcast episode that I used to listen to called The 3 Unicorns. 3 Unicorns was about 3 Black women new into tech, going through their internships, just kind of like in the nuance of tech, and realize quickly, oh, I'm Black in tech. Oh, that's a whole different layer. Wow. So The 3 Unicorns was just about their daily struggles in their lives, and it was just amazing. So the Just Us podcast reminds me of that. It gives me those same feels. It gives me that same, new, unique, happy, but a little bit nervous kind of feel, and I enjoy it. And it's hosted by Danielle, Jeremy, and Treasure. You should totally listen to this if you want to learn more about the Black community around design. So the next podcast is the UI Narrative. The UI Narrative discusses everything around UX process, around design critiques, around designers working with software engineers, around almost everything around UX writing. I mean, it goes on. And the reason why I adore it the most is because it's all presented by Black people. I don't know many people in tech that's Black. So whenever I get a chance to hear about different stories, I literally jump on the opportunity. I go to their Twitters or their Instagrams or their social media, and I follow them. Like, I keep wanting to hear more stories about the Black community. So I believe UI Narrative is underrated. It really is. So that is another podcast that I enjoy. Podcast number 3 is the Revision Path. Revision Path that was one of the first ones I ever known about. I had no idea that people actually talked about the Black design community. So his podcast, Maurice Cherry, his podcast was one of the only podcasts that I can listen to when it comes to design and, the Black community. So I don't know. For me, that is a golden key right there. Maurice tapped into something long before anyone else has, and it's a weekly podcast discussing everything around design, from Black designers, Black developers, Black creatives. It goes on. A few of my most favorite episodes is with Nick Caldwell, Dantley Davis, and Alana Washington. You should totally listen to their podcast episodes, but listen to all of them. They will enlighten you in an amazing way. So those are the 3 episodes that I wanted to pull out of the list because to me they were very special, unique, and different from the rest. So let's go into the rest. So the 4th one is 99% Invisible. Whenever I would go to work, that was one of the podcasts that I listened to while I was working or while I was designing. And there is an episode called The Secret Lives of Color. I love that episode. It kind of reminds me of the Nod episode around like Black history and the nuance of it. But this one goes into the history and the fields of art and color and design. And 99% Invisible to me covers so many layers, and with this particular episode, it was so good. It was so good, y'all. So I would think if you ever have time, listen to The Secret Lives of Color. It was amazing. So the next one is podcast number 5. Hands down, I probably listen to almost every episode. This is the Late Night with Trav and Lowe's podcast episodes. Like, I don't know a day that I didn't listen to this. I even repeated episodes. Literally would turn it back on so I can get a new nugget. Like, that episode, that podcast was just amazing. And they are not recording anymore, which sucks. But there was a long stint of time where they recorded almost every week. So if you go back and listen to some of those podcasts, you would be totally with it. I swear, like, it is. That was a great episode. The next one is podcast number 6. It is The Accidental Creative. Another nugget. I mean, Todd Henry does an amazing job talking anyway. He's an amazing, smooth talker. It is so enlightening to hear what he has to say, and he has a lot of experience with design, with building out leaders. He has so much experience with that creative realm. So listening to his view and his takes they're in line, trust me. I've used a lot of his tips. I have created my own leadership journey. This is an amazing podcast. If you want to be more of a creative leader, if you want to take more initiative, if you want to just jump into design but also have a voice as well, this is definitely the podcast to listen to. He also has a podcast called Daily Creative with Todd Henry. Listen to that too. That one's totally amazing as well. So yeah, I listen to everything Todd Henry, by the way. The 7th podcast that I'm going to discuss is called Design Better Podcast. Design Better Podcast, I mean, come on now. This is a classic. Everyone knows about the Design Better Podcast. They literally have a blog. We love their illustrations. Like, everything about the Design Better Podcast is something that at least everyone in design should be subscribed to. Either it's their newsletter or it's their YouTubes or whatever they have, subscribe. And that's all I'm going to say to that. I'm not going to add it too much because I want you to do your homework and go see it. And the last one is Overtime. The Overtime podcast is hosted by Meg Lewis. And I personally know Meg Lewis. So to see her grow and blossom and just become fully creative in the Overtime podcast is just like, aww, like, I don't know, I just, every time I hear her voice, I'm like, she's just such an amazing person, such an amazing soul, and to see her blossom when it comes to the Overtime podcast and just really hone into who she is, that's what makes me want to listen to it. And I love the topics. It's not just her, but I love the topics as well. So yeah, these podcasts are my favorite, hands down, podcast. But I have one bonus. So one night on the Trav and Lowe's podcast, they talked about a podcast, like a Spanish design podcast, and it's called Diseño Cha Cha Cha. So personally, I listened to it and I'm like, I have no idea what no one's saying here, but because Pablo Stanley is running it, I'm like, this has to be good. I listened to a few episodes that were in English, and those episodes were so enlightening. So I will leave that one as a bonus for anyone interested. And yeah, I hope this episode was enlightening for you just as much as it was for me. And go listen to my favorite podcast. It'll change your life.